Hello and welcome to CUTV. Today we're delighted to be joined by Andrew Marr, who's a political broadcaster and journalist and an alumni here at Trinity Hall. Welcome back, Andrew.
Many thanks.
So I thought I'd like to begin by asking about your time here at Cambridge. What are the highlights, your favourite memories of being a student here, and especially at Trinity Hall?
Well, I came down from Scotland as a sort of pig-ignorant and slightly insecure young man. And the first thing that I remember very vividly is being terrified by the cool London day school kids who knew how to smoke cigarettes, knew how to swear properly, dressed much better than I did. And I was intimidated for about 2 years. And I spent 2 years basically in Trinity Hall bar or hanging around local pubs. So a lot of time, I'm afraid, spent in pubs, did a bit of drama here, and then very quickly got involved in politics and journalism. And then standing for what was then the Cambridge Students' Union, CSU. It's changed its name since then, on the broad left slate. That was great fun.
You mentioned in your book, My Trade, that you're very interested, as you mentioned, in left-wing politics. Have your political views evolved since your time here as a student? And do you think your younger self would have been enthused with this new wave of left-wing politics, particularly with the rise in Corbyn as Labour leader?
There's no doubt that the 19-year-old Red Andy would have been a complete Corbynista, very, very excited by momentum and the whole thing. I was on the left of it's sometimes said that I was a Trotskyist at Cambridge. I wasn't. I was on the left of the Labour Party at Cambridge, but I was very left-wing. And my views were changed dramatically by coming into harsh contact with the outside world, first as a general reporter, and then when I went to The Economist, which is probably the cauldron of pro-market, right-wing thinking, right-wing economic thinking. And everybody argued about everything for 3 or 4 years. And I had a lot of my left-wing economics knocked out of me during my time at The Economist, so I have changed a bit.
So what do you think of the division within the Labour Party?
I think it's a really interesting moment. The Labour Party is in a very difficult place because on the one hand we have a political system in this country which kind of excludes lots and lots of people slightly further to the left, slightly further to the right, or more Green or more UKIP or whatever than the sort of central soft liberal consensus. And I think there's almost, particularly within the media, a kind of soft centre-left, centre-right liberal lynch mob going on at the moment, excluding everybody else. So it's brilliant that the Corbyn campaign brings in and gives a voice to a group of people who are always angry, always felt excluded, and now feel included. That's very good. On the other hand, the Labour Party under Corbyn is very, very unpopular, and its chances of coming back again seem remote.
Do you think there's a shortfall with the current government in providing equality amongst people? Is the whole idea of there being a greater society a complete myth, particularly in relation to, for instance, tax credit?
Well, it was very interesting that at the same time the Conservatives under Cameron and Osborne were talking about being the workers' party. We were the party of the workers, at the same time as they were planning to remove these tax credits from the lowest paid workers who had come to rely on them. Now, there is a problem with tax credits. They have grown enormously as a percentage of the welfare budget, and something at some point will have to be done about that. But without the tapers, without the kind of gentle removal of tax credits so that people can adjust their budgets and so forth, I think they made a terrible mistake. Well, it's clear they made a terrible mistake. And some of the best and most effective critics were actually Tory MPs who were listening to their constituents and were horrified by the result.
Many people understand that newspapers are perhaps partial in their political coverage, but mostly expect balanced and fair coverage from the BBC. Do you think it's fair to say that the BBC is in danger of losing its neutrality? If so, what does this mean for the state of democracy in modern Britain? And is the press too focused on scaremongering and sensationalism?
Well, if the BBC became partial, became clearly one-sided, that would be a catastrophe for the BBC, and it would be a catastrophe for British journalism. I think we would quite soon lose our licence if that happened. Now, I have worked in lots of organisations. I've worked for The Independent, The Economist, The Scotsman, The Express, The Observer. I'm writing at the moment for Sunday Times. I've been in lots of different kinds of newsrooms. And despite what people think, I have never been in any organisation which takes impartiality nearly as seriously as the BBC. It is obsessed and obsessive about fairness and balance, to the point of, during election campaigns, stop watching about how much time different parties get, But endlessly we are asked about our language, to think about our language, lots and lots of debates about what we call so-called Islamic State at the moment. All the time we are thinking about bias. Now, a lot of people just don't believe that. I get a lot of tweets from people on the left who say you're all part of a pro-Tory capitalist conspiracy. And I get lots of tweets from Tories saying, you, Andrew Marr, like most people at the BBC, are fundamentally a communist, and it's perfectly clear from your interviewing style. And occasionally you get people saying, Andrew Marr, it is perfectly clear you are a Marxist with your head up David Cameron's bottom. So probably the hardest thing in my life is trying, every time I do an interview, to maintain a sense of balance. I sit in my chair, I begin the interview. Before I do it, I always think to myself, now out there watching, there are people who vote UKIP, Scottish Nationalist, Labour, Liberal, Tory, and everything else, and Green. And they've all paid their licence fees, and none of them, they should all be able to expect me to represent them in the way I ask my questions, and not to be. So I try very, very hard to be impartial. But if the BBC lost its impartiality, I think the whole ecology of the British media would be changed by that. Because I'm not saying that we keep other people honest, that would be arrogant. But the fact that the BBC tries to be neutral and impartial means the fact that we have papers who don't try to be impartial or neutral at all. That doesn't matter so much. People can go to the papers to get their blood pumping up and down, get angry and get excited and read the views that they love or hate.
But do you not think that it's an unfair monopoly in the press of being completely biased towards perhaps some might say right-wing views? Is there a displacement in priorities?
Well, of course. It requires a huge amount of money now to run a newspaper, and mostly to lose money. Most of the people who run newspapers do so knowing that they're going to lose huge amounts of money. Now, why would anyone want to do that? Because they want influence and they want to be taken seriously in some way. There aren't many people on the left with vast amounts of money to burn to take over newspapers. So by definition, most of the people who run newspapers or own newspapers are on the right, one way or another.
In what way do you see the press going in regards to the EU referendum? Which papers do you predict will have a negative or more positive outlook? I
would predict that there will be overall an anti-Brussels bias in the press during in the run-up to the referendum. I mean, it's perfectly clear that the Express, for instance, will be going for out. I'd be very surprised if the Telegraph doesn't go for out. I'd be surprised if the Sun doesn't go for out. Now, on the other hand, there'll be the Guardian, the Observer. The Times is a very interesting one. The Times is hedging its bets very carefully. I'll be watching the Times very carefully, and the Sunday Times. They'll be pivotal to this. I don't believe that News International works quite as simply as Rupert Murdoch deciding what to do and all his papers following suit. But the press, I would be very surprised if the press is balanced overall on this subject.
Are you quite happy that you've shifted from print media to broadcast journalism? How did you find the transition, and which do you prefer and why?
Well, my first love is where I started. I love print journalism. I love being phoned up by an editor saying we need 1,200 words on Jeremy Corbyn's relationship with the Labour Party left over the last 30 years. And by the way, I want them in an hour and a half. I love doing that. I love bashing out pieces for newspapers. But there's no doubt in the current world, despite the new media, television has got the really big guns. We are the pulverising big medium. We may be crude and brash and all the rest of it, but in terms of having an influence, television is still where it's at. We get about 2 million people watching the show on a Sunday morning, and there's very few newspaper columnists who can get that kind of influence. I love television. I love the immediacy of it. I love the danger of it. Anything can go wrong at any moment, and lots of things have gone wrong to me live on air. And that sense at the pit of your stomach, there are 6 million people watching. If I say the wrong word, if I say the F word or something goes wrong, I could destroy my career and my mortgage and my life just like that. And there's always a little devil on your shoulder saying, God, say it. So I love the danger of television, I guess, is the big excitement.
What do you say has been your sort of most dramatic interview, or the interview that sort of stood out as your favourites?
Some of the dramatic moments that I remember would include when John Sentamu, the Archbishop of York, suddenly pulled off his dog collar live on camera, pulled out a pair of scissors and started to cut it up. And he said, I'm destroying my dog collar, and I'm not going to put my dog collar on ever again so long as Mugabe is in power. And that was a real moment. There was a moment when I was asking Alistair Campbell, I think something about the Iraq War, and he started to cry. That was a really extraordinary moment. And then I suppose, for me, the most difficult and dramatic moments were probably interviewing Putin and Obama. Not at the same time, I hasten to add, separately. Obama, a particularly clever guy. And I think when you're doing an interview, when I'm doing an interview, I quite often have a series of kind of questions designed to lead to a certain point where I have, as it were, trapped somebody and got them where I want them, and they're answering something they didn't want to talk about. And with Obama, you could just see a kind of amused flicker in his eyes. He goes, I see where you're going. And he'd head me off at the pass, sentences before I got where, very, very nicely, very gently. But it was like playing tennis with kind of Andy Murray. It was pretty intimidating.
So you mentioned earlier that you enjoy the high-pressured environment of print journalism. That's something you really, really enjoy. Would you say stress is your Achilles heel?
Absolutely. I think my big problem in life is that I push myself too hard. That's certainly why I had a stroke. I'm not saying it's my only big problem in life. Maybe I'm not clever enough, maybe I'm not, charismatic enough, but one problem is I push myself too hard. I had my stroke after doing the history of the world for 2 years, which meant writing a big fat book with no research. I wrote it all myself, crisscrossing the world to do the film pieces to camera. So huge numbers of international flights. Lots and lots of very long days in sort of dusty hotels in Mongolia and China and South America and stuff. Great fun, but I was doing that and then flying back every weekend to do the Sunday show, and quite often do start the week on the radio in the morning and then straight off again to Heathrow to do the next round of filming. And while writing the book simultaneously, in the airport lounges and on the long flights. And by the end of that, I was absolutely shattered. And I can remember doing the Andrew Marr show just before I had the stroke, and reviewing the papers was Jane Moore, the columnist from The Sun, who knows me quite well. We sat down to breakfast and she looked at me and she said, Andrew, you look absolutely terrible. You look shattered. You've got to stop. And I said to her, apparently, there'll be plenty of time to sleep when I'm dead. And then 2 days later, next day I had a near fatal stroke. So there's no doubt that my stroke was, in my view, was connected to overwork. But I don't blame the BBC for that or anybody else. That was my choice. I pushed myself too hard.
So I guess this leads nicely onto what's next?
That's a very good question to which I don't have a very good answer.
You didn't seem to be stopping down. If anything, you seem to increase momentum since your stroke.
Well, I've produced 2 books this year. I'm not writing a book at the moment, which is unusual for me, partly because what's happening in the BBC is a lot of money is going towards drama at the moment. The great pressure of Netflix and the box sets and all of that, we kind of feel we have to try to measure up. So there's less money around for the documentaries. So it's harder to get big historical documentaries commissioned at the moment. There is a couple that I really want to do. I'm doing one on my own brain recovery from stroke, and I'm doing one on the Scottish referendum. I think that there's going to be another referendum. I think Scotland may well leave the UK, but I'm going to be talking to politicians and doing that. But beyond that, there's a couple of big historic projects I want to do. I'd love to do something big on the Russian Revolution. Of course, it's 100 years in 2017. And I'd love to do a really good, proper, comprehensible, popular history of China. I would love a chance so that ordinary folk who don't know much about China can sit in their living room and come away thinking that they really understand China. That's the next thing I'd love to do. So I think that would probably be my next big project. And then if my current novel, Children of the Master, sells as well as the first one, there'll be a third one. I'd like to write a trilogy about politics, but through novels.
And Children of the Master is out now.
Out now in all good bookshops, and really, really interesting, guys.
And on that note, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much indeed.